Adi Godrej. There is a lot of reference to and comparison with China in India. My question is, how much such reference to and comparison with India have you noticed in China?
Repeat that last part.
Yeah. There is a lot of reference to and comparison with China in India. My question is, how much such reference to India and comparison with India have you noticed in China?
Well, I think it's safe to say that it's a highly competitive environment. And I believe that China looks south on a regular basis to take note of India's innovative drive. There is a spirit of innovation that resides in India that can't be denied. If you had to ask the most important thing for China in the years ahead, what they would like to achieve more than anything else on the economic side of the ledger, I believe they'd like to crack the code on innovation. I think to them, innovation, figuring out how to create a free marketplace in which there is some tolerance for risk, access to capital, good educational institutions, ecosystems of industries, nascent industries that will represent the industries of tomorrow. I think that is their wish. And as they look around the world, there aren't many centers of innovation that exist. Yet I would argue that innovation, today for innovative countries, the world has never looked brighter. When you look at the cost of sequencing genes today, pennies compared to $150 million to sequence a gene back in the late 1970s. When you consider the price of a telephone call from the United States to India, $12 a minute back in the 70s versus less than a penny today. When you consider other key aspects of innovation that will involve health sciences, biotechnology, information technology, which I think will drive the future, you have a microcosm for success here. The United States has been a leader in this area as well, if the government doesn't screw it up. I mean, the free market is poised to do great things in the years ahead in the United States. The only barrier on the horizon really is government. China watches this play out, learning and adapting models of their own. I don't know that cracking the code on innovation is going to be an easy thing for China to do, because you need a healthy dose of one element called freedom that is in great supply here and great supply in the United States, and certainly does not exist in many parts of China. But I believe that they will always be looking south with an eye on India, and how India continues its growth drive, its creation of new industries, and specifically the economic relationship between the United States and India, which was very small not so many years ago, and today shows, I think, great prospect for success.
Yeah.
Ambassador, my name is Rajesh Shah. Thank you for a very comprehensive explanation about China and what's going on in China. Given that they have to deal with hundreds of millions of people who are still looking for jobs and who will be part of urbanization, growth, a new generation, all the other issues, the pressures of the internet and modernizing, and that they've integrated into the world, and they're going to integrate much more with investing more money. What do you see immediately, and maybe over the next 5-10 years, their views on conflict, whether they will go out or they will support people who are into conflicts? What would be their views on nuclear proliferation? How do you see whether they will take steps along with the rest of the world, the way the United States is trying to do, for making sure that North Korea or Iran or other such countries denuclearize?
I think a question of peaceful rise, and that is something because we have a border dispute with China. There are worries in India about Chinese military assertiveness. So I think that kind of thing that behind all this.
It's an excellent question. if you stop to think that their number one priority will be maintaining primacy of the party, I mean, let's just stop to think about the objectives when you're sitting in Zhongnanhai or the Great Hall of the People. What's objective number one? Objective number one is maintaining the primacy of the party. Again, the carryover from Deng Xiaoping's worldview outlined in the late 1970s. In order to keep the party in power, you must maintain stability within society. Never an easy thing to do in China. In order to address that, it means first and foremost you have an economic challenge, which means you have to keep employment at a certain level. Because beyond that, you have a large flow of itinerant workers who tend to migrate from the central part of the country and put stresses and strains on the city centers, which are very, very destabilizing in nature. So you want to keep employment at a certain level. That also means that you're going to spend enormous amounts in the form of stimulus spending to make sure that you can keep employment at that level. Hence, roads to nowhere, inventories that might be out of balance somewhat, major infrastructure projects throughout the country, which I believe once the accounting is done may reflect that we have a lot more to worry about in the area of non-performing loans, similar to what was seen in Japan maybe 20 years ago. I'm not sure that we have yet a full accounting of all of the spending that has taken place in recent years, roughly $600 to $700 billion per year in the form of stimulus spending to keep the country engaged, therefore stability in check. Then you take, that key priority and you add to it the expectations from the outside world, now that China's on the world stage. And they have to look at this new stepped-up role in a very cautious way. How much can we get involved globally? How much can we get involved in conflict resolution? Or how far or aggressively to project our military without finding ourselves in trouble? I think one of the more interesting statistics that really tends to put a lot of it in perspective is to look at how much China is spending on the Ministry of Public Security and the Ministry of State Security, which watches, of course, the internal affairs, versus how much they're spending on the Ministry of Defense. It might surprise a whole lot of people to learn that they're spending more money on their domestic security apparatus than they are, in fact, on defense, which certainly leads most observers to the conclusion that therein lies their biggest challenge going forward. So many might think that they're focused on the world, they're focused on the South China Sea, they're focused on the periphery of 15 different nation states around them, some of whom are terribly challenged from time to time. I would argue just the opposite. I would argue their real concern going forward, because it has everything to do with the all-important element of stability, is right at home. That said, being on the world stage, the expectations are going to be enormous. That China will step up its role with respect to Korea, with respect to Iran, with respect to the South China Sea, with respect to Burma, Pakistan. And I'm not sure how prepared they are to do much beyond just the initial steps that would be expected of them as a major regional player. Why? Because they've never ventured before. They're new to this side of the balance sheet, being involved internationally, dealing with conflict resolution. The one area where they have made a stepped-up effort, I would have to say, is in the whole area of peacekeeping. They have made significant strides in the area of contributing some of their troops to UN peacekeeping operations. But beyond that, there isn't much to show for it. They will be looked to, whether they are comfortable with this thought or not. They will be looked to by the international community to take a stepped-up role in the years to come. And that's where they're going to have to process internally whether they can afford to venture out at a time when they've got so much to look after within.
Yes, the gentleman there. Yeah.
Governor Huntsman, is...
Sorry about that.
Yeah, please ask your question.
James Lamont of the Financial Times. Mr. Huntsman, how did you read the fall of Bo Xilai this week, and how would that inform your view of what might happen between now and October in the party congress?
How do I read the Bo Xilai incident?
Yeah.
It seems to me, and I don't want to say too much about it because there's so much unknown at this point, but this would seem to be a message loud and clear on corruption, which I think is a significant concern among the people in China. If you disaggregate the messages within the blogosphere, you see a lot of talk about corruption. What were the conversations that took place in the run-up to June of 1989, if we remember back in that period? Inflation, costs on the rise, unemployment, and corruption. These were the issues of instability. And I think corruption in the minds of many in central leadership is a very, very big one that must be addressed and must be addressed in a high-profile fashion. And my read is that this is an extension of that. Second would be that politics in China is a rough-and-tumble business. I think this is the latest very open and public evidence of that, evidence of what happens behind the velvet curtain that most of the world never sees.
Ms. Baveja at the back. Yeah. Yeah, Ms. Baveja.
Sir, to what extent is the issue of Tibet a challenge for China? And are we going to continue to see the brutal clampdown, or are we going to see any meaningful dialogue?
I think this is an extremely complicated question for China because it gets right to the heart and soul of sovereignty. And if ever there was a centerpiece important to China's worldview, and one thing that informs their thinking like nothing else, it is sovereignty. So when the maps are pulled out at the end of the Qing dynasty, 1911, 1912, and they look at the world that belongs to them, you have Taiwan, Hong Kong, Mongolia, Xinjiang, Tibet, islands in the South China Sea. And their objective from a foreign policy standpoint is to say, we're not going to rest until we recover all of our lost territory. So because this becomes a sovereignty issue, it makes it absolutely intractable. And then you add on to that the religious and the cultural sensitivities. I've been to Lhasa. I've met His Holiness. I've met many leaders in Lhasa, and I think there is a very unsettled population, not just in Tibet, but in parts of Qinghai and parts of Sichuan as well. And I believe that's going to be exacerbated with the end of His Holiness, Dalai XIV. We all wish that he could remain on and travel the world well beyond his age today, but sadly that won't be possible. What happens next? And I believe what happens next will be a critically important step in terms of improving that relationship between the Tibetan people and the government of China. And if it goes down like we saw the Panchen Lama and the rise to power of Beijing's Panchen Lama, if the same thing were to happen in terms of the way in which the next Dalai is chosen, I believe that could cause grounds for serious grievances. It's a problem that is crying out for dialogue. And sadly, the rounds of dialogue that have taken place in Beijing have not yielded much and will not yield anything certainly this year, being a political transition year, with the hopes that once Xi Jinping is able to consolidate his power base, 2013 and 2014, there may be an opening, there may be a new view of Tibet, at least in terms of how the dialogue should be handled, that would breathe a little bit more confidence into this issue. That certainly would be my hope.
Yeah, I have a question. Harinder Baveja from Headlines Today. Ambassador, how would you analyze the Pakistan factor in the India-China relationship?
Well, you're really going to get me in trouble, but since I'm not a candidate for anything anymore, I guess we can just talk about anything. I would say that the Pakistan equation for the United States has been a sad story. It has gone from a relationship in which there was some hope for regional collaborating and problem solving to a relationship that has become transactional in nature. And I think the United States should be absolutely straight up and honest about their expectations out of Pakistan. They have not been in the past. I think their expectations have far exceeded the relationship's ability to deliver. But I think there is a significant opportunity, regionally speaking, for the United States to step up its relationship with India. I think this is a relationship that is prime for enhancements, both economically and on the security side, because of the shared values that I talked about earlier. For a relationship to work, you can't only have shared interests, as we have in the U.S.-China relationship, 40 years of shared interests, trading and investment and cultural exchanges. You must have shared values. That's the glue. That's what gives permanence and sustenance to any meaningful relationship. And I would argue that's at the core of the U.S.-Indian relationship, and it means to me that we have an opportunity, in light of some of the regional troubles, to step up our relationship.
Well, this has got to be the last question, and unfortunately, we're out of time now. Yes.
Ambassador Huntsman, you've been watching China for almost 30 years, you said, and one major transformation has been that China today has 20% extra testosterone, meaning the gender imbalance. I believe there are 20% or 18% excess male because of the one-child policy. What's the impact on this, not just on China, but the world? Because you just mentioned economic nationalism, growing sense of jingoism. So is this gender thing going to affect the world as well? 20% extra males.
Are you arguing that the chemical testosterone is a dangerous one? Listen, this is an area for social scientists to take a very, very good look at, because if you just look at the numbers, you could argue that, you know, by some estimates, 70 million women, females, have gone missing from society. So there will be a gender disequilibrium that will continue. Now, I have an adopted Chinese daughter, as I do an Indian daughter, so I am a beneficiary of China's one-child policy and their preference for boys. In light of having no social security system, it is the boy who will ultimately take care of you in later years. But I do believe there are ultimately some public policy issues that will have to be addressed in dealing with this gender equilibrium. How you deal with it, what the implications are for domestic security, so on and so forth. But this is all part of the demographic imbalance that China is just on the cusp of trying to deal with, both economically and from a social standpoint.